Jeremy Gomez stood frozen in the doorway of his shared apartment, watching his roommate Anthony Hernandez curl up on the couch with a book. And for the first time in 3 months, he understood exactly what had been happening between them. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath as Anthony looked up with those warm brown eyes that had been haunting Jeremy's dreams for weeks now. Anthony's lips curved into that soft smile that made Jeremy's chest tighten, with something he'd been desperately trying to ignore. And in that moment, Jeremy knew he was completely and utterly lost. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, how a simple comment about sleeping better had unraveled everything Jeremy thought he knew about himself, he would need to go back to the beginning. Back to 3 months ago when Anthony first moved in, carrying boxes and wearing that easy grin that had made Jeremy's heart skip in a way he'd convinced himself was just surprised at finding such a considerate roommate. Back to when Jeremy still believed he was straight, still thought the warmth that spread through his chest whenever Anthony laughed was just friendship, still told himself that the way he found excuses to linger in the kitchen when Anthony was making coffee was perfectly normal roommate behavior. The apartment had felt different from the moment Anthony walked through the door. Jeremy had been living alone for 2 years, content with his routine of work, gym, and the occasional date that never seemed to lead anywhere meaningful. He'd posted the roommate ad more for financial reasons than companionship, expecting to find someone who would keep to themselves and split the utilities. Instead, he'd found Anthony, who filled the space with warmth and laughter and an easy presence that made the apartment feel like a home for the first time since Jeremy had moved in. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take you on an emotional journey that will change everything you think you know about love and self-discovery. Anthony had moved in on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Jeremy was already questioning things he'd never thought to question before. It started small, with Jeremy noticing how Anthony's eyes crinkled when he smiled, how his voice carried through the apartment like music, how he had this habit of humming while he cooked that made Jeremy want to stay in the kitchen just to listen. Jeremy told himself it was just appreciation for having such a pleasant roommate, but deep down, in a place he wasn't ready to acknowledge yet, he knew it was something more. The first month passed in a blur of shared meals and late-night conversations that stretched longer than they should have. Anthony was a graduate student in psychology, passionate about his research in ways that made his whole face light up when he talked about it. Jeremy found himself asking questions just to see that spark in Anthony's eyes, just to hear the enthusiasm in his voice as he explained concepts that Jeremy barely understood but found fascinating when they came from Anthony's lips. They fell into a routine without discussing it, as if they'd been living together for years instead of weeks. Anthony would make coffee in the morning, always brewing enough for two even though Jeremy had never asked. Jeremy would cook dinner most nights, claiming he enjoyed it, but really just wanting an excuse to spend time with Anthony in the warm, intimate space of their kitchen. They would eat together at the small table by the window, talking about their days, their dreams, their fears, sharing pieces of themselves that Jeremy had never shared with anyone else. It was during one of those dinners that Anthony first mentioned his ex-girlfriend, Christina Clark, and Jeremy felt something twist in his chest that he couldn't name. Anthony spoke about her with a kind of distant sadness, explaining how they'd broken up 6 months ago after 2 years together. The relationship had been comfortable, he said, but something had always felt missing. He'd loved her, he was sure of that, but there had been an emptiness that he couldn't explain, a sense that he was going through the motions of what a relationship should be rather than feeling what it actually was. Jeremy listened and offered the appropriate sympathetic responses, but inside he was struggling with a confusing mix of relief and guilt. Relief that Anthony was single, though he couldn't examine too closely why that mattered so much. Guilt because he found himself glad that Anthony's relationship had ended, even though he could see the genuine sadness in his roommate's eyes when he talked about it. The second month brought a shift that Jeremy felt but couldn't articulate. Anthony started staying up later, often joining Jeremy on the couch after dinner, instead of disappearing into his room to study. They would watch movies or just talk, and Jeremy became acutely aware of the space between them on the couch, how it seemed to shrink a little more each night. Anthony had this habit of tucking his feet up under him when he got comfortable, and sometimes his knee would brush against Jeremy's thigh, sending electricity shooting through Jeremy's entire body. Jeremy began to notice things about Anthony that he told himself were just observational, nothing more. The way Anthony's hair fell across his forehead when he leaned forward, how he unconsciously bit his lower lip when he was thinking, the soft sound he made when he stretched after sitting in one position too long. Jeremy memorized these details without meaning to, storing them away like treasures he didn't understand the value of yet. It was during this time that Anthony started having trouble sleeping. He mentioned it casually one morning, dark circles under his eyes as he nursed his second cup of coffee. He'd been having nightmares, he said, nothing specific, just a general sense of anxiety that followed him into sleep and left him restless and tired. Jeremy felt a protective instinct surge through him that was stronger than anything he had ever experienced, a desire to somehow shield Anthony from whatever was troubling his dreams. The nightmares got worse over the following weeks. Jeremy would hear Anthony moving around in his room at night, sometimes getting up to make tea or sit on the balcony until dawn. Jeremy wanted to help but didn't know how, didn't know if it was his place to offer comfort to someone he was only just beginning to understand he cared about in ways that went far beyond friendship. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night in early November. Jeremy had been lying in bed, listening to Anthony pace in the next room, when he heard a soft knock on his door. He opened it to find Anthony standing in the hallway in pajamas, looking vulnerable and exhausted and so beautiful that Jeremy's breath caught in his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you," Anthony said quietly, his voice rough with sleeplessness. "I know this is weird, but I was wondering if maybe I could sleep in here tonight. Not in your bed," he added quickly, color rising in his cheeks. "I could just sleep on the floor or something. It's just that when I'm alone, the dreams are worse. And I thought maybe if I could hear someone else breathing, someone I trust, it might help." Jeremy's heart hammered against his ribs as he processed the request. The rational part of his mind knew this was dangerous territory, knew that having Anthony in his room would only intensify whatever he was feeling. But looking at Anthony's tired eyes and the hope mixed with embarrassment on his face, Jeremy couldn't bring himself to say no. Jeremy heard himself say, "Quote time." The relief that flooded Anthony's face was worth every bit of confusion and longing that Jeremy knew this decision would cost him. Anthony disappeared for a moment and returned with his pillow, settling carefully on the far side of Jeremy's bed with a space between them that felt both too wide and not nearly wide enough. They lay there in the darkness, both pretending to sleep while acutely aware of each other's presence. Jeremy could hear Anthony's breathing gradually slow and deepen, could feel the warmth radiating from his body across the space between them. For the first time in weeks, Anthony slept peacefully, and Jeremy lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to him. The next morning, Anthony thanked him with a smile that made Jeremy's chest ache with affection. He looked rested for the first time in weeks, and when he offered to make breakfast as a thank you, Jeremy found himself agreeing even though he usually just grabbed coffee on his way to work. They didn't talk about it, but that night, Anthony appeared at Jeremy's door again, this time without the lengthy explanation. Jeremy welcomed him without question, and again, Anthony slept peacefully while Jeremy lay awake, hyper-aware of every breath, every small movement, every moment when Anthony shifted in his sleep, and the space between them seemed to shrink just a little. This became their new routine. Every night, Anthony would knock softly on Jeremy's door, and Jeremy would let him in, and they would lie in the darkness together. Not touching, but somehow more intimate than Jeremy had ever been with anyone. Anthony never had nightmares when he slept in Jeremy's room, and Jeremy began to understand that whatever was happening between them was helping Anthony in ways that went beyond just the comfort of not being alone. The third month brought a new level of awareness that Jeremy could no longer ignore. Anthony had started lingering closer when they talked, standing near enough that Jeremy could smell his shampoo and see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Their conversations had grown deeper, more personal, touching on subjects that Jeremy had never discussed with anyone. Anthony would ask questions about Jeremy's past relationships, his dreams for the future, his fears and hopes, and Jeremy found himself being more honest than he'd ever been with another person. It was during one of these conversations, sitting on the couch after dinner with Anthony curled up at the other end, that Anthony asked a question that changed everything. "Jeremy," Anthony said, his voice thoughtful and slightly hesitant, "can I ask you something kind of personal?" Jeremy's pulse quickened, but he nodded, setting aside the book he'd been pretending to read. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be with a man?" Anthony asked, not meeting Jeremy's eyes. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Jeremy wasn't sure he was ready to face. His mouth went dry as he tried to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal how much he'd been thinking about exactly that question lately, specifically in relation to the man sitting across from him. I think, Jeremy said carefully, that attraction is probably more complicated than most people want to admit. Why do you ask? Anthony was quiet for a long moment, his fingers playing with the hem of his shirt in a gesture Jeremy had learned meant he was nervous about something. I've been thinking about it lately, Anthony admitted, about why my relationship with Christina never felt quite right, why I always felt like I was performing rather than just being. And I keep coming back to this idea that maybe I've been looking for the wrong things in the wrong places. Jeremy's heart was beating so hard, he was sure Anthony could hear it. To return to quote Fortin, Anthony said simply, quote 15. Jeremy wanted to ask if Anthony felt that kind of connection with him, wanted to tell him that he'd never felt as safe or understood with anyone as he did during their late-night conversations and quiet mornings. Instead, he just nodded and said, "That sounds lonely." It was, Anthony agreed, and when he looked up, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been hope. But it's not anymore. The weight of that statement settled between them, and Jeremy felt something shift in the air, as if they'd crossed a line that neither of them had been aware they were approaching. Anthony's gaze dropped to Jeremy's lips for just a moment, so briefly that Jeremy might have imagined it, but the flush that crept up Anthony's neck suggested he hadn't. They didn't talk about it that night, but when Anthony came to Jeremy's room, he settled a little closer than usual, close enough that Jeremy could feel the warmth of his body without them actually touching. Jeremy lay awake longer than ever, hyper-aware of every breath Anthony took, every small sound he made in his sleep, every moment when he shifted and their arms almost brushed. The next few weeks were a study in tension and unspoken questions. Jeremy caught Anthony watching him sometimes, his gaze lingering in ways that made Jeremy's skin feel too tight. Their conversations grew more charged, dancing around subjects that neither of them seemed quite ready to address directly. Anthony would ask questions about love and connection and what made relationships work, and Jeremy would answer as honestly as he could while trying not to reveal how much his answers were influenced by his growing feelings for the man asking them. They started touching more, small gestures that could be explained as friendship, but felt like something else entirely. Anthony would put his hand on Jeremy's shoulder when he passed behind him in the kitchen. Jeremy would brush Anthony's hair back when it fell in his eyes during their movie nights. Their knees would touch when they sat on the couch, and neither of them would move away. The breaking point came on a Friday night in December. They'd had dinner and were sitting on the couch, ostensibly watching a movie, but really just talking in the low, intimate voices they'd developed for their evening conversations. Anthony was telling Jeremy about his research, about how he'd gotten interested in psychology because he'd always felt like he was observing human behavior from the outside, trying to understand connections he'd never quite experienced himself. Anthony said, his voice soft and thoughtful. Quote 22. Jeremy's breath caught, and when he looked at Anthony, he found those warm brown eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made his heart race. Anthony, Jeremy said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know, Anthony replied, though Jeremy hadn't finished his thought. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, but both knew they eventually would. Jeremy felt his world tilt on its axis as Anthony's words sank in, confirming what he'd hoped for, but hadn't dared to believe. The relief was overwhelming, followed immediately by a terror so acute it made his hands shake. I've been thinking about you, Anthony continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. About us, about what this is and what it could be. I've never felt anything like this before, Jeremy. With Christina, with anyone. You make me feel like I'm finally awake after years of sleepwalking through my own life. Jeremy's throat felt tight as he tried to process what Anthony was saying. Anthony asked, and Jeremy nodded. Quote, Jeremy felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as the words he'd been longing to hear finally filled the space between them. I've been going crazy trying to figure out what was happening to me, he admitted. I've never felt this way about anyone, man or woman. I thought maybe I was losing my mind. Are you scared? Anthony asked, and Jeremy could hear the vulnerability in his voice. Terrified, Jeremy said honestly, but also more hopeful than I've ever been in my life. Anthony smiled then, that soft, warm smile that had been undoing Jeremy for months, and slowly, carefully, he reached across the space between them and took Jeremy's hand. The contact sent electricity shooting up Jeremy's arm, and he had to resist the urge to pull Anthony closer, to close the distance between them entirely. "What do we do now?" Jeremy asked, looking down at their joined hands. "I don't know," Anthony admitted. "I've never done this before, but I know I don't want to go back to pretending this isn't happening." Jeremy squeezed Anthony's hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his own. Cartoon 37. They sat like that for a while, hands linked, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Jeremy felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall, but knowing that staying where he was wasn't an option anymore. "Can I ask you something?" Anthony said eventually. Jeremy nodded, his thumb unconsciously stroking across Anthony's knuckles. To 39, Anthony said, quote, for someone. Jeremy's cheeks heated as he remembered those first nights, the exquisite torture of lying so close to Anthony without being able to touch him. "I barely slept for weeks," he admitted. "I was so aware of you that it felt like my skin was on fire." Anthony's breath hitched slightly. Quote 43, quote Arna, Jeremy said softly. Quote Tiny, quote Austin, Anthony said, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote the admission hung between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Jeremy felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he looked into Anthony's eyes and saw his own longing reflected back at him. "Anthony," Jeremy said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah? Can I kiss you?" The question seemed to surprise Anthony. "Ty," said Anthony, his eyes widening slightly before a smile spread across his face that was so full of joy and relief that it took Jeremy's breath away. Quote 51, Anthony said, and then he was moving closer, closing the distance between them on the couch until they were breathing the same air. Jeremy cupped Anthony's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across those sharp cheekbones he'd been admiring for months. Anthony's eyes fluttered closed, and Jeremy took a moment to memorize this. The weight of Anthony's face in his hands, the trust and vulnerability written across his features, the knowledge that they were about to cross a line that would change everything between them. When Jeremy finally leaned in and pressed his lips to Anthony's, it was like coming home and setting off fireworks at the same time. Anthony made a soft sound against his mouth, his hands coming up to grip Jeremy's shirt as he kissed back with a sweetness that made Jeremy's chest ache with affection. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative and questioning, both of them learning the shape of each other's mouths, the taste and texture of something they'd both been dreaming about for months. But as the initial surprise and nervousness faded, it deepened into something more urgent, more certain. Anthony's hand slid up to tangle in Jeremy's hair, and Jeremy pulled him closer until Anthony was practically in his lap, their bodies pressed together in a way that felt both new and utterly natural. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Anthony rested his forehead against Jeremy's and smiled that soft, wondering smile that Jeremy was already addicted to. Quote 52, Anthony breathed. Quote 53, Jeremy agreed, his voice rough. Quote 24. They stayed like that for a while, foreheads touching, sharing breath and small kisses, and quiet words of amazement. Jeremy felt like his entire world had shifted, like he was seeing color for the first time after years of black and white. Everything made sense now, the months of confusion and longing and sleepless nights. This was what he'd been missing, what he'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just attraction to a man, but this specific connection with this specific person who made him feel more like himself than he'd ever felt before. "I should probably tell you," Anthony said eventually, his voice soft and slightly shy, "that I've been thinking about kissing you for weeks. Sometimes when we're talking, I lose track of what you're saying because I'm too busy staring at your mouth." Jeremy laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep in his chest. "I thought I was being so obvious. I was sure you'd figure out how I felt and run screaming." "Never," Anthony said firmly. "Even if this hadn't happened and even if you didn't feel the same way, I wouldn't have run. You've become too important to me." The words settled around Jeremy's heart like a warm blanket, and he kissed Anthony again, slower this time, savoring the reality of being able to do this, to touch and be touched by the person who had become the center of his world without him even realizing it. They talked until late that night, curled up together on the couch, sharing kisses and confessions and plans for a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. Anthony told Jeremy about the moment he had realized his feelings had shifted from friendship to something deeper. How it had been during one of their morning coffee rituals when Jeremy had smiled at something Anthony said, and Anthony had felt his heart skip in a way that was definitely not platonic. Jeremy shared his own moment of realization. How it had been watching Anthony read on this very couch, seeing the way the afternoon light caught in his hair, and feeling such a surge of affection and longing that he'd had to leave the room to catch his breath. When they finally made their way to bed that night, it was together in a way that was entirely new. Instead of lying carefully on their separate sides, they curled into each other, Anthony's head on Jeremy's chest, Jeremy's arms wrapped around him protectively. For the first time since this all began, Jeremy slept as peacefully as Anthony did. Both of them finally safe in the knowledge that what they felt was mutual and real and worth whatever challenges lay ahead. The next morning brought a new kind of nervousness as they navigated their first day as whatever they were now. They hadn't defined it yet, hadn't put labels on what was happening between them, but the shift was undeniable. Anthony made coffee for both of them, as always, but now he pressed a soft kiss to Jeremy's temple when he handed him his mug. Jeremy cooked breakfast, but now Anthony stood close enough to steal tastes and brush against him as he moved around the kitchen. Everything was the same and completely different, and Jeremy found himself grinning at random moments throughout the day, unable to contain the joy that kept bubbling up inside him. They spent the weekend in a bubble of new discovery, learning each other in ways they'd only dreamed about before. They talked about their fears and hopes, about what this meant for their friendship and their living situation and their futures. Anthony admitted that he was nervous about what his family would think, about coming out as something he wasn't even sure he had words for yet. Jeremy shared his own concerns about navigating a relationship that was unlike anything he'd experienced before. But underneath all the practical concerns and legitimate fears was a bedrock of certainty that what they had found in each other was worth whatever challenges they might face. The connection they'd built over months of friendship had only grown stronger now that it was allowed to flourish, without the barriers they'd both been unconsciously maintaining. The following week brought the first real test of their new relationship when Anthony's ex-girlfriend Christina called, asking if they could meet for coffee to talk about getting back together. Anthony told Jeremy about the call immediately, his face troubled as he explained that Christina had been having second thoughts about their breakup and wanted to see if there was still a chance for them. Jeremy felt a stab of jealousy so sharp it surprised him, followed immediately by guilt for feeling possessive of someone he'd only just begun to explore a relationship with. But Anthony's response to his obvious distress was immediate and reassuring. Quote 60, Anthony said, taking Jeremy's hands in his, I want to be honest with her about why I can't give her what she's looking for. She deserves to know that it's not about her, that I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. The conversation with Christina was difficult but necessary. Anthony met her at the coffee shop where they'd had their first date 2 years earlier, and he told her gently but honestly that he had fallen in love with someone else, someone who had helped him understand what had been missing from their relationship. Christina was hurt, of course, but she was also understanding in a way that surprised Anthony. She admitted that she'd felt the distance between them too, the sense that they were both holding back parts of themselves even when they were trying their hardest to make it work. I hope he makes you happy, she said as they parted ways, and Anthony felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. When Anthony came home that evening, Jeremy was waiting anxiously in the kitchen, having spent the entire day worrying about how the conversation would go and what it might mean for them. But one look at Anthony's face told him everything he needed to know. Quote 63. Anthony said simply, and Jeremy crossed the room to pull him into his arms, holding him close and feeling the last of his fears about Christina's place in Anthony's life melt away. They spent that evening talking about the future, about what they wanted their relationship to look like, and how they wanted to navigate the practical aspects of dating while living together. They decided to take things slow, to let their relationship develop naturally without putting pressure on themselves to define it too quickly or meet anyone else's expectations about what it should be. The holidays were approaching, and both of them were nervous about how their families would react to the news of their relationship. Anthony's parents were traditional and had always assumed he would marry a woman and give them grandchildren. Jeremy's family was more liberal, but he'd never given them any indication that he might be interested in men, and he wasn't sure how they would handle the surprise. They decided to tell their families separately, each taking responsibility for their own parents and siblings. Anthony planned to have the conversation over Christmas dinner, while Jeremy decided to call his parents and tell them over the phone before his planned visit home. The call to Jeremy's parents went better than expected. His mother was surprised but supportive, asking gentle questions about Anthony and expressing her desire to meet him soon. His father was quieter but not disapproving, and by the end of the conversation, Jeremy felt cautiously optimistic about bringing Anthony home to meet them in the new year. Anthony's conversation with his family was more challenging. His parents were confused and concerned, asking questions about whether this was just a phase and whether Anthony had considered therapy to work through what they saw as confusion about his sexuality. It was painful, but Anthony held firm in his conviction that what he felt for Jeremy was real and important, and that he hoped they would eventually come to accept and support his relationship. The holidays passed with some tension, but also with hope. Anthony's parents needed time to process, but they didn't cut off contact, and they expressed willingness to meet Jeremy eventually. Jeremy's family was welcoming and warm, inviting Anthony to join them for New Year's Eve and treating him like the important person in Jeremy's life that he had become. As winter turned to spring, Jeremy and Anthony settled into a rhythm as a couple that felt as natural as their friendship had before. They maintained their evening routines of cooking together and talking on the couch. But now those conversations were punctuated with kisses and touches that no longer had to be hidden or explained away. They slept in the same bed every night, Anthony's nightmares a thing of the past now that he was able to curl up against Jeremy's chest and feel completely safe and loved. Jeremy discovered that being in a relationship with a man was both exactly what he'd expected and completely different from anything he could have imagined. The emotional connection he'd built with Anthony translated seamlessly into physical intimacy, but there were also new territories to navigate, new ways of understanding his own body, and desires that sometimes left him feeling like he was discovering himself for the first time. Anthony was patient and generous, approaching their physical relationship with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything else. They took their time learning each other, communicating openly about what felt good and what they wanted to try, building trust and intimacy in layers that felt solid and lasting. The academic year was ending, and Anthony was facing decisions about his future that would affect them both. He'd been accepted to a PhD program at a university across the country, an opportunity that would normally have been an easy yes, but now felt complicated by his relationship with Jeremy. They spent long nights talking about the possibilities, about whether Jeremy could find work in the new city, about whether their relationship was strong enough to survive a long-distance period if necessary. In the end, the decision was made easier by an unexpected opportunity. Jeremy's company offered him a position in their branch office in the same city where Anthony's program was located, a promotion that would advance his career while allowing them to stay together. It felt like a sign that they were on the right path, that the universe was conspiring to help them build the life they both wanted. The process of moving together, of making plans and decisions as a couple, strengthened their relationship in ways that surprised them both. They learned how to compromise and support each other through stress, how to balance their individual goals with their shared dreams. Jeremy watched Anthony pack up his books and research materials and felt a deep sense of pride in being chosen as the person Anthony wanted to build a future with. Their last night in the apartment where they'd found each other was bittersweet. They lay in bed together talking about all the memories they'd made in these rooms, all the conversations and discoveries and quiet moments that had led them to this point. "I'm going to miss this place," Anthony said, his head on Jeremy's shoulder. Quote 65. Jeremy agreed. Quote 6. Anthony lifted his head to look at Jeremy, his eyes soft with affection. Quote 67. Quote, "I don't know," Jeremy said simply. Quote, "Wow." Anthony kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Quote 71. He said the words still new enough to make Jeremy's heart skip. "I love you too," Jeremy replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The move to their new city was an adventure that brought them even closer together. They found a small apartment near Anthony's university, with big windows that let in lots of light and a kitchen just big enough for them to cook together without getting in each other's way. Jeremy started his new job and found that he loved the work and the colleagues, while Anthony threw himself into his graduate studies with renewed energy and focus. They made new friends, both as individuals and as a couple, and Jeremy was continually amazed by how naturally Anthony fit into every aspect of his life. Watching Anthony charm Jeremy's new coworkers at office parties, seeing him light up when he talked about his research with other graduate students, Jeremy felt a constant undercurrent of gratitude for the series of coincidences and choices that had brought them together. Their relationship continued to deepen and evolve as they navigated the challenges and joys of building a life together. They had their first real fight about 6 months after the move, a disagreement about money and spending priorities that escalated into raised voices and hurt feelings before they both stepped back and remembered how much they cared about each other. The process of working through the conflict, of learning how to argue constructively and forgive completely, taught them both valuable lessons about partnership and commitment. Anthony's parents came to visit during the summer, their first meeting with Jeremy since learning about their son's relationship. It was awkward at first, but Jeremy's genuine warmth and obvious devotion to Anthony gradually won them over. By the end of the weekend, Anthony's mother was asking Jeremy about his work and his family, and his father was discussing sports with the kind of casual friendliness that suggested acceptance, if not complete understanding. Jeremy's family embraced Anthony completely, treating him like the son-in-law they'd always hoped Jeremy would find. His mother delighted in cooking Anthony's favorite foods when they visited, and his father enjoyed having someone to discuss psychology and human behavior with at family gatherings. As their second year together began, Jeremy and Anthony started talking seriously about the future, about marriage and children, and the kind of life they wanted to build together. Anthony was thriving in his graduate program, his research on attachment and relationship satisfaction taking on new dimensions informed by his own experience of finding love in an unexpected place. Jeremy had been promoted again at work and was considering starting his own consulting firm, a dream that felt achievable with Anthony's support and encouragement. They talked about getting married, about making their commitment official in the eyes of the law and their families. The conversation felt natural and right, not driven by external pressure, but by their own desire to publicly declare what they both knew in their hearts, that they had found in each other a love worth building a lifetime around. The proposal, when it came, was perfectly them. Jeremy had been planning something elaborate, but in the end, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening as they sat on their couch, Anthony reading while Jeremy pretended to work on his laptop. Jeremy looked up and saw Anthony in the lamplight, his hair falling across his forehead as he concentrated on his book, and felt such a surge of love and certainty that the words just spilled out of him. Quote 72, Jeremy said, and Anthony looked up with surprise that quickly melted into joy. Quote 7 verse, Anthony asked, setting his book aside. Quote 7 version, Jeremy said, closing his laptop and moving closer. Quote 7. Anthony's answer was a kiss that tasted like tears and laughter and promises, and when they broke apart, he whispered yes against Jeremy's lips with such conviction that Jeremy felt his heart might burst with happiness. The wedding planning process brought their families together in ways that surprised everyone. Anthony's parents, who had struggled initially with accepting their son's relationship, found themselves charmed by Jeremy's mother's enthusiasm and his father's practical approach to organizing events. Jeremy's family welcomed Anthony's relatives with open arms, and by the time the wedding day arrived, both sides felt like they were gaining not just an in-law, but an entire extended family. They chose to have a small ceremony in the garden behind Jeremy's childhood home, surrounded by the people who mattered most to them. Anthony's research advisor served as one of his groomsmen, while Jeremy's college roommate stood up for him. Both of their mothers cried during the ceremony, and both of their fathers made speeches at the reception that brought everyone to tears. The vows they wrote for each other were deeply personal, reflecting not just their love, but the journey they'd taken to find each other. Anthony spoke about how Jeremy had taught him what it meant to feel truly seen and accepted, how their friendship had shown him what he'd been missing in all his previous relationships. Jeremy talked about how Anthony had helped him discover parts of himself he'd never known existed, how loving him had made Jeremy feel more authentically himself than he'd ever felt before. Their honeymoon was a trip to Europe, 2 weeks of exploring new cities and cultures together, of long conversations over wine and lazy mornings in bed, and the simple joy of being newlyweds in love. They visited museums and cafes, took long walks through historic neighborhoods, and spent hours just talking about their hopes and dreams for their marriage. When they returned home, they settled into married life with the same ease they'd brought to every other transition in their relationship. Anthony was in his final year of graduate school, working on his dissertation while also teaching undergraduate courses. Jeremy had started his consulting firm and was building a client base that kept him busy but fulfilled. They bought a house together, a small place with a garden where Anthony could grow the herbs he liked to use in his cooking, and a home office where Jeremy could meet with clients. They adopted a rescue mutt named Charlie who became Anthony's constant companion during his long hours of dissertation writing. The years that followed were full of the ordinary magic of a life built together. Anthony finished his PhD and got a position at a local university while Jeremy's business grew and thrived. They traveled together, hosted dinner parties for their friends, navigated the challenges of Anthony's academic career and Jeremy's entrepreneurial ventures. They talked about children and decided to start the process of adoption, wanting to provide a home for a child who needed one. The process was long and sometimes frustrating, but it also brought them closer together as they imagined the family they wanted to create and the values they wanted to pass on. When they were finally matched with a little girl named Sophia, a 3-year-old with dark curls and bright eyes who had been in foster care for most of her life, they felt like their family was finally complete. Sophia was shy at first, overwhelmed by the idea of a permanent home, but Anthony's gentle patience and Jeremy's steady warmth gradually won her over. Watching Anthony become a father was one of the greatest joys of Jeremy's life. He was naturally gifted with children, able to get down on Sophia's level and see the world through her eyes, to provide the security and love she needed to flourish. Jeremy found his own parenting style, more practical but no less devoted, and together they created a home where Sophia could heal and grow and become the confident, happy child she was meant to be. 5 years into their marriage, as they sat on their back porch watching Sophia play with Charlie in the garden, Jeremy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a simple roommate arrangement, a practical decision that had nothing to do with love or attraction or the possibility of finding his soulmate. But somehow, through a series of small moments and quiet revelations, they had built something beautiful and lasting. Anthony had been right all those years ago when he'd said that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard. Jeremy had never imagined that he could fall in love with a man, had never questioned his own sexuality, or considered the possibility that his perfect partner might not fit the image he'd always had in his mind. But loving Anthony had taught him that attraction and connection were far more complex and mysterious than he'd ever understood. It wasn't about gender or labels or fitting into predetermined categories. It was about finding someone who saw you completely and loved you anyway. Someone who made you want to be the best version of yourself. Someone who felt like home in a way that transcended physical attraction or social expectations. Their relationship had been tested over the years by external pressures and internal doubts, by career challenges and family dynamics, and the ordinary stresses of building a life together. But through it all, the foundation they'd built during those early months of friendship and discovery had held strong, providing a bedrock of trust and understanding that could weather any storm. Anthony looked over at Jeremy and smiled, the same soft, warm smile that had been undoing Jeremy for years now, and reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined automatically, a gesture so natural and familiar that Jeremy barely noticed it anymore, except for the way it still made his heart skip just a little. Quote 76. Anthony asked, following Jeremy's gaze to where Sophia was teaching Charlie to sit and stay with treats from her pocket. Just this, Jeremy said, squeezing Anthony's hand. Quote 78. Quote 7 Anthony repeated thoughtfully. Quote 80. Jeremy nodded, understanding exactly what Anthony meant. They had both been searching for something without knowing what it was, both feeling incomplete in ways they couldn't articulate. The connection they'd found in each other had filled those empty spaces, had made them both more whole and complete than they'd ever been alone. Sophia came running over, breathless and laughing, with Charlie close behind her. She climbed into Anthony's lap without hesitation, the way she always did when she wanted comfort or attention, and Jeremy felt that familiar surge of gratitude for the family they'd built together. Daddy, Sophia said to Anthony, using the title that still made his eyes shine with happiness. Can we have ice cream for dessert? I think that can be arranged, Anthony said, kissing the top of her head. But only if you help Papa Jeremy clean up the kitchen after dinner. Sophia turned to Jeremy with a grin. Deal, Papa. Jeremy laughed and ruffled her hair, marveling at how naturally she'd fit into their lives, how completely she'd made their house feel like a home. The adoption process had been challenging, but every difficult moment had been worth it to see Sophia flourish in their care, to watch her learn to trust and love and feel safe in the world. As the sun set behind the trees in their backyard, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jeremy felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him. This was the life he'd never dared to dream of, the happiness he'd never known he was missing. Anthony had been right when he'd said that sometimes the most frightening dares led to the most beautiful discoveries. The journey from roommates to lovers to husbands to fathers had been filled with moments of terror and uncertainty, times when Jeremy had wondered if he was making the right choices or if he was strong enough to handle the challenges that came with loving someone so completely. But every step of the way, Anthony had been there, steady and patient and endlessly supportive, helping Jeremy navigate his own fears and doubts with the same gentle wisdom he brought to everything else. Their love story wasn't the one Jeremy had expected to live, but it was the one he'd needed. It had taught him that love could surprise you, that the person meant for you might not look like what you'd imagined, but would feel like coming home anyway. It had shown him that the bravest thing you could do was to be honest about what you felt, even when that honesty might change everything. Looking at Anthony now, holding their daughter while she chattered about her day and made plans for tomorrow, Jeremy felt the same flutter of attraction and affection that had caught him so off guard all those years ago. Anthony's hair was a little grayer now, his face marked by laugh lines and the gentle wear of time, but he was still the most beautiful person Jeremy had ever seen. Quachada, Jeremy said quietly, the words as true now as they had been the first time he'd said them. Anthony looked over at him with that smile that still made Jeremy's heart skip, still made him feel like the luckiest person in the world. I love you too, he replied, and in those simple words was the weight of their entire history together, all the moments of discovery and growth and deepening connection that had brought them to this perfect evening in their garden. Sophia had fallen asleep in Anthony's arms, exhausted by her day of play and adventure. Jeremy watched as Anthony carefully carried her inside, tucking her into bed with the gentle care that had made him such a wonderful father. When he returned to the porch, he settled back into his chair next to Jeremy, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Quote 88. Anthony asked eventually. Jeremy considered the question, trying to imagine a world where they'd remain just roommates, where the connection between them had never been acknowledged or explored. I think we would have found our way to each other eventually, he said. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe it would have happened differently, but I don't think something this strong could have stayed hidden forever. Anthony nodded, leaning back in his chair. I'm glad we didn't have to wait any longer than we did. I'm glad we were brave enough to take the risk. Me too, Jeremy agreed, reaching for Anthony's hand again. Code 93. They sat together until late that night, talking quietly about their plans for the weekend, about Sophia's upcoming school play, about Anthony's research and Jeremy's latest client projects. The conversation was ordinary and comfortable, the kind of easy intimacy that came from years of sharing a life together. When they finally went inside, they moved through their nighttime routine with the synchronized efficiency of long practice. Anthony checked on Sophia while Jeremy let Charlie out one last time. They brushed their teeth side by side at the bathroom sink, the same way they had in their first apartment, and Jeremy felt a deep sense of continuity, of having built something lasting and beautiful. In bed, they curled together the way they always had, Anthony's head on Jeremy's chest, Jeremy's arms wrapped around him protectively. It was the same position they discovered that first night when Anthony had asked to sleep in Jeremy's room, afraid of his nightmares and seeking comfort in the presence of someone he trusted. Now, years later, there were no nightmares, no fears about what the morning might bring. There was only the steady rhythm of their breathing, the warmth of their bodies pressed together, and the quiet certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they'd been searching for all along. As Jeremy drifted off to sleep, he thought about the young man he'd been when Anthony first moved in, how lost and incomplete he'd felt without even realizing it. That man could never have imagined the happiness that was waiting for him, the love that would transform his understanding of himself and what was possible. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories were indeed the ones that caught you completely off guard, the ones that challenged everything you thought you knew about yourself and opened doors you didn't even know existed. Jeremy had learned that love wasn't about fitting into predetermined categories or meeting other people's expectations. It was about finding someone who made you feel completely yourself, someone who saw all of you and chose to stay anyway. And as he fell asleep with Anthony safe in his arms and their daughter sleeping peacefully down the hall, Jeremy knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, living the love story he'd never dared to dream, but had always been meant to find.